All right, let's talk about something almost no one wants to admit exists in Warhammer 40k. The retired Guardsmen. Not the fallen ones, not the martyrs whose names echo through Ministorum sermons, not the shattered bodies lying in trenches on Armageddon, Cadia, or countless unnamed death worlds. No. We're talking about the ones who survive. The ones who, against every law of probability and cruelty, somehow live long enough to lay down their laser guns and walk away. And that's where the horror really begins. You see, in a universe where everything is designed to chew through human life like ammunition, survival isn't noble. It's awkward. It's inconvenient. It's a statistical anomaly that no one really knows what to do with. The Astra Militarum is a war machine, not a cradle of compassion. There's no grand farewell ceremony, no golden retirement pension. When the wars end, if they ever do, you don't get a hero's welcome. You get a transport ticket to somewhere cheap, somewhere out of sight, somewhere that doesn't make the rest of the Imperium ask uncomfortable questions. And that's why this topic matters, because it cuts right through the blood-stained glory and shows the raw, ignored humanity behind the meat grinder. It asks, what kind of life is even left to live after you face the warp, chaos, tyrannids, and worse, and one only to return home broken, haunted, and forgotten? These soldiers, these relics of 1,000 wars, are the living ghosts of the Imperium. And today, we're going to talk about them, not as statistics, not as propaganda, but as people who were never meant to survive and yet somehow did. Let's peel back the layers and see what really happens to the few Guardsmen who survive too long. All right, let's be honest. When people talk about the Astra Militarum, nobody expects anyone to make it out alive. It's a running joke in the fandom that the only retirement plan for a Guardsman is death by bayonet, bolter, or orbital bombardment. And honestly, it's not even a joke. The numbers, what little we can scrape together from lore, tell a grim, unforgiving story. Survival isn't just rare, it's statistically microscopic. Most Guardsmen don't live long enough to finish their first campaign, let alone survive long enough to retire. The ones who do? They're not just lucky, they're something else entirely. Anomalies in a universe that doesn't tolerate anomalies for long. Let's talk about the scale of it. The Imperium fights on literally millions of fronts at any given time. Entire regiments are raised, thrown into meat grinder worlds like Valhalla, Vrax, or Cadia, and never even make it to the third week. We know from fan estimates that the average lifespan of a frontline Guardsman in active war zones is measured in days, sometimes hours, depending on the theater. Imagine stepping off a transport and being told, "You've got 36 hours, tops." And yet, they still march. They still fight. That alone should tell you what kind of humans we're talking about. There are stories, always whispered, always doubted, of units where a handful made it out after years of combat. Not elite stormtroopers, not Kasserkin, just standard infantry. Maybe they were garrisoned on some fortress world that didn't see action for a while. Maybe their regiment was used more for occupation than direct assault. Maybe they were simply left behind and forgotten. A sad but common fate in a bureaucracy as bloated and slow as the Administratum. And if you manage to make it through all that, if you dodge the chainswords, the psychic nightmares, the morale breakdowns, and the friendly fire, you still have to survive the warp travel, the plagues, the logistics shortages, the poor rations, the executions for cowardice, the summary trials by commissars who are more trigger-happy than the enemy. It's a miracle. No, seriously, some planets worship surviving Guardsmen as saints, and I can see why. There's something deeply haunting about the idea of a man who lived through 40 campaigns, watched all his friends die, kept marching through hell, and came out the other side with his mind mostly intact. You can't tell me that isn't worthy of reverence, but at the same time, I think the Imperium hates them for it, because these survivors are a reminder that the system isn't perfect, that sometimes a human being can outlast the very machine that was built to break him. Some fans theorize that entire classes of veterans are quietly taken care of by the Departamento Munitorum, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. that it's easier to disappear them than to deal with what they represent. The uncomfortable truth that survival in the Astra Militarum is not part of the plan, that it's not supposed to happen. Think about it. The propaganda doesn't have room for men with missing limbs and haunted eyes. It needs martyrs, not old soldiers with questions. It needs purity of message, and there's nothing messier than a survivor who remembers the truth of war. There's also the problem of logistics. In a system where most guardsmen are raised from hive worlds, death worlds, or feral colonies, there's no infrastructure for retirement, no pension system, no housing, no therapist. You're demobbed, handed a tattered coat, maybe a voucher, and then left to your own devices. If you're lucky, you make it to a halfway colony or some administrative processing hub. If not, you fade into the cracks, like dust in a hive city's ventilation shaft. I've seen fan accounts, made up sure, but with that weird grain of possible truth, of veterans who ended up as janitors, bounty hunters, PDF trainers, or even preachers. Some go mad, some go numb, some try to go home, only to find out their planet's been destroyed, or worse, annexed by chaos, and now they're the heretic for trying to return. Can you imagine that? Coming home, only to get executed for stepping on the wrong soil? But despite all that, some still survive. They carry the weight of a dozen wars in their bones. They limp, they cough, they drink too much corpse-starched liquor, but they live. And for those of us in the fandom, they're some of the most fascinating characters the universe never talks about, because survival in this setting isn't just rare, it's heretical. It questions the whole system. And in a world where blind sacrifice is the norm, that's perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. So yeah, when we talk about retired guardsmen, we're not talking about a peaceful sunset on a green hill. We're talking about miracles wrapped in trauma, limping through the galaxy like ghosts no one wants to see. And that's exactly why we should be looking. Because those few who survive too long, they're the ones with the clearest eyes of all. When a guardsman survives long enough to be released from duty, and that's already an impossible rarity, the next question is painfully simple. What now? There's no ceremony, no handshake from a general, no grand parade welcoming you back. More often than not, you're just quietly removed from the deployment list, given some vague clearance papers stamped by the Departamento Munitorum, and pushed toward the nearest outbound transport hub. You're no longer useful as a soldier, and the Imperium doesn't have a place for anything that's no longer useful. But you're not dead, and now, for the first time in possibly decades, you have to figure out how to live. Some end up in the most obvious place, the local planetary defense forces. It's almost like a downgrade, really. You go from endless trench warfare and hive collapses to patrolling dusty borders or training soft-bellied recruits who've never fired a laser gun in real combat. But it makes sense. The PDF is often the closest thing a planet has to an organized military presence outside the Imperial Guard, and they always need people who know what a battlefield actually looks like. Veterans bring that raw edge. They've seen the real thing. The panic when Vox traffic dies, the stink of blood in your throat after hours in rebreather masks, the silent horror of watching artillery flatten a regiment in under a minute. That experience turns them into valuable assets, at least on paper. The reality, though, is often sadder. PDF officers don't always respect Guard vets. There's a weird tension. You'd think experience would command respect, but sometimes the brutality of the Guard makes them seem like mad dogs to softer, planetary forces. There are stories of veterans being given desk jobs or sidelined into ceremonial roles just to keep them out of the way. Imagine surviving 8 decades of war, only to be made a security advisor for an ammunition depot that sees zero action in a decade. Then there are those who drift into civilian life, and calling it that is being generous. Some are thrown into labor pools, often in manufactorums, where their physical conditioning is seen as an asset. But a laser gun doesn't prepare you for a servo press or a vat of chemical solvents. There's something tragic about that too. Men who once held the line against orcs or tyrannids, now hauling crates or cleaning clogged waste filters in underhive refineries. It's not glamorous. It's not heroic. It's just quiet and empty, and no one salutes you anymore. I've seen fan discussions about ex-guardsmen becoming enforcers in hive cities, joining local law enforcement or private militias. That makes some sense. They're tough, they're disciplined, and they don't flinch when things get ugly. But that kind of job can eat away at whatever soul you have left. Some become just another thug in a flak vest, enforcing the whims of a corrupt guild lord or gunning down starving rioters with the same precision they once used against heretics. There's a dark irony to it. You fight to protect the Imperium, only to end up turning your last pistol on the citizens you're supposedly serving. There are brighter spots. A few veterans end up as instructors for new regiments being raised. It's rare, but it happens. Those are the ones who still have a spine for discipline and a heart that hasn't rotted from trauma. Imagine some green kid from Necromunda or Vostroya getting drilled by a grizzled old survivor with 3 fingers, 2 bionic legs, and a voice like gravel. Those moments, those little fragments, might be the only real way experience gets passed down. And some fans argue that's the only real legacy a guardsman ever leaves. Not medals, not promotions, just survival, handed down like a scarred old handbook. Of course, there are also those who try to return home. Emphasis on try. Plenty of worlds don't keep track of who they send out, and even fewer care to take anyone back. Sometimes the guard veteran arrives home to find their city turned to ash, their family names erased by administrative error, or their entire world declared lost to chaos incursion. There's one theory that really stuck with me, that some regiments are intentionally recruited from worlds that won't exist in 20 years. That way, there's never a question of return. No logistical nightmare, no awkward reintegration, just another body for the grinder. So, what do? They adapt. Some start preaching, becoming wandering speakers for the Imperial Creed, not because they found faith, but because it gives them a role. Others turn mercenary, those who still have fight in them but no more loyalty. They take jobs for rogue traders, frontier colonies, even radical inquisitors. Some fans love these stories, turning them into legends. The old guard vet who becomes a protector of a mining town, or the one who teaches a whole generation to resist a genestealer cult. But more often than not, it's not that romantic. The truth is, for every one of those rare endings, there are 1,000 others who just disappear. No one writes down their names. No one thanks them. They simply vanish into the underlayers of the Imperium, swallowed up by a society that demands their sacrifice but recoils at their survival. And maybe that's what makes these few paths so bittersweet. They're not rewards. They're leftovers. Scattered chances at meaning, handed to those too stubborn or too broken to die when they were supposed to. So if you're ever reading about some hive world enforcer with a limp or a grumpy PDF instructor who doesn't speak unless it's to yell, think twice. That could be a man who once held the line on Cadia. That could be the only survivor of the 35th Necromundan, living quietly because it's the only thing he can still do. And just maybe, buried under all that silence, is a story the Imperium was never supposed to hear. If there's one thing more mythical than a retired guardsman, it's a place made for them. Not a battlefield, not a manufactorum floor or a slum in a hive's underbelly, but an actual honest-to-throne space where veterans can live, breathe, and not be immediately swallowed by war or poverty. These places aren't official. They're not advertised by the Munitorum. But in the darker corners of fan lore, in half-lost documents and whispered stories on data slates that circulate through the underhives, you'll find mentions of them. Veteran colonies, sanctuaries, honor houses. Whatever you want to call them, they're the Imperium's closest thing to a peaceful afterlife. On this side of death, anyway. The most famous theory is that of Ozymandias, an entire agri-world supposedly repurposed into a retirement planet for Astra Militarum veterans. According to legend, it was sanctioned by a sympathetic Lord Sector decades ago and has quietly continued operating because no one higher up bothers to check. The idea is beautiful in its absurdity. Endless fields, calm skies, and row upon row of prefabricated habs where old soldiers raise groks, fish, and drink cheap amasec while telling stories of wars no one else remembers. It's probably not real, but I want it to be. We all do. Because even in this nightmare universe, it's comforting to believe that someone out there decided the Emperor's warriors deserved more than an unmarked grave or a forgotten name on a casualty list. Then there are the so-called Brotherhood bastions, fortified shelters hidden across fringe systems. These are less about peace and more about survival. Supposedly founded by veteran officers, these enclaves act as semi-militarized communes, a mix between fortress monastery and drinking hall. The tales say they're self-sufficient, fiercely guarded, and accept only those with the scars, physical or mental, that prove they've been through hell and back. I've read forum threads where people roleplay as residents of these places, talking about how every morning starts with physical drills, followed by storytelling sessions, tactical simulations, and then hours tending the land or repairing gear. It's like therapy by war, healing through routine, through brotherhood, through remembering who you were before you became disposable. And it makes a weird kind of sense. Who else could understand the trauma of a guardsman but another guardsman? Who else knows what it's like to walk through warp-choked trenches and feel your own heartbeat count down to oblivion, only to somehow keep marching? These enclaves, if they exist, are built on that shared pain. Not pity, not charity, just mutual recognition. You survived. So did I. Let's survive a little longer, together. Some hive worlds, especially those with extensive military cultures, are rumored to have hidden levels or sealed districts reserved for their veterans. Not officially, of course. The administratum doesn't issue permits for compassion. But maybe the local governor looks the other way. Maybe an old colonel cashed in favors from his service days. Maybe there's a part of Hive Tarsus where you can find a dozen old men in battered flak armor playing regicide and glaring at the world outside, daring it to interrupt their peace. It's never clean. It's never nice. But it's theirs. There's also the idea of the honor houses, one of the more somber traditions. These are said to be buildings, often annexes to Ministorum temples or abandoned PDF barracks, turned into quiet homes for the truly broken. The ones who can't adapt. The ones whose minds didn't survive the war, even if their bodies did. They're not hospitals. They're not guarded. They're just spaces. A room, a bunk, maybe a clean robe and a meal. No expectations, no judgment, just the dignity of silence. I've read stories of veterans who don't speak for decades, who sit and stare at walls painted with images of the Emperor, because they simply have nothing left to say. Some fans call these places the last trench, where the final battle is fought in the mind, against the memories. I once came across a fan tale about a forge world that maintains a secret hangar bay, its staff composed entirely of retired guardsmen who once defended it from orc invasions. They weren't dismissed, they weren't discarded. They were quietly absorbed into the fabric of the place, left to serve not as warriors, but as silent guardians, walking among the servitors and the machine priests. It's a beautiful idea, that you could become part of something without being erased by it. And then there's the darker version, the places where the veterans go when there's nowhere else. Abandoned mines turned into squatter settlements, derelict freighters orbiting dead moons, filled with those who couldn't fit into any society anymore. Broken men clinging to broken steel, holding tight to memories of honor while the galaxy forgets they ever existed. Some of them build shrines. Some of them keep fighting ghosts. Some of them just drink themselves into oblivion day after day, praying for a death that doesn't come. These aren't homes, they're limbos. And yet, even there's a strange kind of fellowship, because even in suffering, there's unity. What all these theories, legends, and half-true whispers tell us is this. The Imperium might not care for its veterans, but veterans care for each other. They build their own shelters, form their own circles, pass down knowledge, trade scars like currency. In a galaxy that burns everything it touches, maybe that's the most revolutionary thing of all. Not rebellion, not heresy, but memory. Shared memory, held between those who were never meant to survive, and yet did. And if you ever find yourself walking through a forgotten outpost or a half-dead village in some fringe system, and you see a man with a 1,000-yard stare tending a small garden with hands that once held a chainsword, show him respect. You might be looking at one of the few who made it out, and he might be the last living memory of a war the Imperium has already erased. One of the most painful truths about the few guardsmen who survive long enough to be called veterans is that they don't really come back whole, not physically, and definitely not mentally. The Imperium doesn't build its soldiers to last. It builds them to serve, and once they've outlived that service, they're often left to deal with the wreckage on their own. There's no medical rehabilitation program, no long-term care, no therapy. In the Imperium, pain isn't just a symptom, it's a language. It's how the machine of war speaks to the body. And when the machine is done with you, all that pain just stays, echoing in your bones, in your thoughts, in your dreams. Let's start with the body. Guardsmen are broken in more ways than we can count. Limbs lost to last fire, bones shattered by shock waves, faces melted by plasma splash, lungs scarred from breathing toxic trench air. Many of them carry bionics, cheap, clunky augmetics bolted into flesh by overworked medici who barely remember their names. There's nothing elegant about it. These aren't the polished limbs of a high-ranking officer or a mechanicus tech priest. They're iron tools, rattling with every step, grinding with every movement. And half the time they don't work right. I've read fan reports of veterans whose mechanical arms seize up in cold weather or spark when exposed to humidity. Imagine trying to rebuild a life when your own body is a faulty relic of war. And then there's the pain. Not the kind that goes away with time. The chronic kind. The phantom kind. Bionics itch in places that no longer exist. Shrapnel that couldn't be extracted still burns under the skin. Joints grind together from untreated trauma. There's no relief. Painkillers are rare and usually reserved for active duty personnel. Civilians, especially unwanted veterans, are expected to cope. Some turn to Amasec, others to narcotics if they can find them. But most, they just live with it. They wake up every day hurting and go to bed the same way. It's not strength, it's endurance. A dull, stubborn refusal to let the pain finish what the battlefield couldn't. But honestly, it's the mind that suffers most. The Imperium doesn't believe in psychological care. There's no such thing as PTSD when trauma is your daily bread. You're expected to accept the horror, to internalize it, bury it, never speak of it again. And if you do speak about it too much, if you show instability, the administratum might start asking questions. Questions that lead to reports. Reports that lead to a visit from the Arbites. Or worse, the Inquisition. So most veterans stay quiet. But silence doesn't mean peace. It just means the war continues in private. Some veterans lose their grip completely. They start to see enemies where there are none. They lash out at shadows. They mistake children for cultists. There are accounts of guardsmen who barricade themselves in abandoned hab units, convinced they're still on the front lines, building traps and muttering unit callouts to themselves until the day they die. And it's hard to blame them. When you've spent 30 years knowing that every shape in the distance might be a demon, a sniper, or something worse, how do you suddenly unlearn that? How do you not jump at every sound? Others go numb, not violent, just hollow. They walk through life like servitors without implants. They don't react, they don't smile, they don't connect. You talk to them and it's like their eyes are looking through you, searching for something they lost long ago. Some fans say these are the burnt-out cases, the ones who gave everything and came back with nothing left to give. They're the ones you see sweeping streets, working sanitation, or just sitting alone in temple corners with a blank stare. You think they're harmless until you see the tattoo on their forearm or the medals stuffed in their pack. And the worst part? There's a stigma. The Imperium loves its heroes in theory, but not when they're limping through the marketplace, mumbling to themselves, smelling of rusted metal and blood memories. People avoid them. Children are told not to stare. Employers cross their names off applications. There's no honor in survival, only discomfort. Because these veterans are living reminders of a truth the Imperium doesn't want to face. That war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It stays in you. It carves holes in your identity, and it never ever lets go. I've seen fan works where someone tries to imagine what a real recovery might look like, a veterans commune or a traveling chaplain who specializes in trauma. But those are just fantasies. In canon, there's nothing like that. Just the expectation that if you're not dead, you should be grateful. Even if every night is a battlefield in your own mind, even if your dreams are full of screaming bolter fire and the smell of promethium. And sometimes the most heartbreaking part is how veterans talk about it themselves. When they do speak, if they ever trust someone enough to open up, it's rarely about heroism. It's about survival, yes, but often tinged with guilt. Guilt for making it out when others didn't. Guilt for the things they had to do to stay alive. Guilt for feeling nothing at all when everything around them burned. That kind of weight doesn't go away. Not in this galaxy. Not in a place where compassion is weakness and faith is supposed to be stronger than pain. So next time someone mentions retired guardsmen like it's some peaceful final chapter, remember what that really means. It means walking wounded. It means fighting battles that no one else sees. It means waking up every day with the war still screaming in your bones. They may not carry a laser gun anymore, but their war is far from over. And most of them know it probably never will be. There's a certain breed of guardsmen who, after surviving the unthinkable, doesn't get tossed aside. They're not sent to rot in some forgotten hive slum or stuffed into a labor unit on a backwater agri-world. No, a select few are taken aside, not honored, never that, but repurposed. Because as much as the Imperium treats human life like currency, there are times when the right kind of broken soul is exactly what someone needs. Especially if that someone is the Inquisition or the Adeptus Mechanicus. For these shadowy corners of the Imperium, there's value in experience soaked in blood, in loyalty born of trauma, and in the kind of mind that's already seen too much to flinch. It starts quietly. Maybe a commissar whispers a name into a Vox channel. Maybe a Magos runs a background check on a guardsman who refused to die during a Necron incursion and decides he's worth a second look. The point is, these things never happen in the open. There's no announcement. One moment, a veteran is nursing a ruined knee and a half-functional augmetic eye, and the next, they're gone, shipped off-world, files sealed, reassigned under classified authority. The stories that leak back are never confirmed, but they're too consistent to ignore. One path leads to the Inquisition, and that's where things get strange. Some veterans become part of what's called the retinue, not full Inquisitors, of course not, but assets, tools, watchdogs with scars and instincts no amount of training can replicate. Witch hunters, heretic killers, Xenos trackers. These are the men and women who stand just behind the rosette, flanking their master in silence, their hands never far from their weapons. They're not trusted, but they don't need to be. They're there to do what they've always done, to fight, to endure, to die, if ordered. The craziest thing is that for some of them, it's a step up. Compared to the chaos of trench warfare or a decades-long meat grinder on some demon-infested planet, life in the Inquisition is almost structured. There's purpose again. Orders that make sense, even if they come with layers of secrecy. Sometimes they're even respected, feared, sure, but respected. You'll hear fans talk about legendary retinues made entirely of former guardsmen. The sniper who once held a ridge on Cadia for 3 days straight, now picking off rogue psychers. The demolitions expert who survived 4 hive collapses, now used to breach cult dens. These aren't just stories. They're warnings. Because the Inquisition doesn't waste resources. If you're still breathing after everything, you will be used. And then there's the Mechanicus, a whole different monster. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, a guardsman isn't a soul with memories. They're a functional shell with military instincts, raw material for something else. You lose your name quickly in their service. Sometimes your voice, sometimes more. I've read theories about Skitarii units made almost entirely of former guardsmen, rebuilt, rewired, reforged. A few bolts here, a data spike there, and suddenly the trauma is gone, not healed, just overwritten. Memory converted into code, fear burned out and replaced with logic routines. You become a cog, and for some veterans that's actually preferable. No more thinking, no more pain, just orders. There's something tragic about it, though, because even if your flesh is replaced, you're still you, somewhere deep down. Maybe that's why some Skitarii units act off, a half-second slower when ordered to fire on a civilian crowd. A twitch of hesitation in combat zones that resemble too closely the ones they used to know. It's not enough to call it rebellion, just a flicker, like a ghost inside the machine. And fans have long speculated whether some tech priests intentionally use veterans because they want that edge, that tiny spark of intuition, that shred of humanity that a fully grown Skitarii, vat-grown drone could never have. Some veterans get pulled into specialized task forces that straddle the line between Inquisition and Mechanicus. Radical acolyte cells, black ops kill teams, the kinds of outfits that don't technically exist. They get new names, new gear, and missions that are less about honor and more about silence. Destroying forbidden tech, hunting rogue Astartes, purging rogue data spirits. It's dirty work. But what part of their life wasn't dirty? And then, there's the strangest outcome of all, those who end up in ecclesiarchy-aligned purging units. Imagine surviving 30 years of war, only to be handed a flamer and told your new job is burning out cultists from sewer warrens, guided by a zealot who believes pain is proof of the Emperor's love. There's a dark poetry in that. Veterans becoming instruments of blind faith after a lifetime of trying to survive its consequences. Some embrace it. Others go along with it because it's easier than asking questions. And a few lose themselves completely, becoming the kind of monsters they once fought. But what ties all these fates together is one chilling truth. Second chances in the Imperium aren't gifts. They're tools, reassignments. A new chapter only if you accept that your story is no longer yours. And yet, weirdly, that's still better than being forgotten. For some Guardsmen, a life of secrecy and servitude is the only path left that offers meaning. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny flicker of redemption. So, when you hear about a silent enforcer standing behind an Inquisitor, or a too efficient Mechanicus soldier who never quite fits in, or a cloaked figure moving through the underhive with the discipline of a soldier, but the silence of a ghost, remember, they might not be new. They might just be survivors, living their second life the only way they were ever taught. With purpose, with violence, with silence. There's something especially cruel about the moment when a Guardsman realizes that there's no homecoming. Not because his world was destroyed, not because his regiment was lost, not even because his body is too broken to make the journey. But because the Imperium has already moved on without him. He was a tool. And now that tool has been discarded. There is no parade, no ceremony, no grateful crowd. There is just silence. Indifference. A man standing alone, hungry and hollow, in a system that no longer remembers his name. You hear stories, always secondhand, of old soldiers trying to use their rank or medals to get food, shelter, or at least a little dignity. They flash a scrap of parchment signed by some long-dead commissar, expecting it to mean something. But in a hive of 20 billion people, one more wounded man means nothing. Administratum clerks won't even look up. If you're lucky, they'll send you to a ration line. If you're unlucky, they'll call the enforcers for loitering. And if you make a scene, there are places where you can still get disappeared, even without committing a crime. Forgotten heroes make for uncomfortable reminders. It's not just the lack of resources, it's the emptiness. These are men and women who lived every day with purpose. Wake up, clean your weapon, get your orders, watch your brothers and sisters die, survive one more day. Now they wake up on a floor in a half-collapsed hab, wondering where to find their next meal. There's no front line, no voice yelling orders, just hunger, noise, and the gnawing realization that you don't belong anymore. There's a haunting kind of poverty in this galaxy. Not just the physical kind, though that's everywhere. It's spiritual too. When your entire identity was being a soldier, what's left when that's stripped away? You see veterans lining the back alleys of hive cities, wrapped in tattered flak cloaks, eyes sunken, hands shaking. Some talk to themselves. Others just sit, silent, watching as the world flows past them like runoff water in a storm drain. They aren't dead, but they've stopped living. And no one notices. One fan theory I've always found devastating but believable is that many veterans deliberately head to the worst parts of the hive, not because they're suicidal, but because it's the only place their instincts still make sense. The constant threat of violence, the need to stay alert, to sleep with your back to the wall, that's familiar, comfortable even. You drop a former Cadian sergeant into a crime-ridden sump sector, and yeah, he might get stabbed. But he might also thrive in a way he never could in a quiet hab on a mid-hive level. Because at least down there, the war never really ends. Some try to start over, open a stall, find work in menial labor, maybe even join a local shrine. But it's rare that it sticks. Civilians don't understand them. There's a gap that can't be crossed. One fan wrote a short story that stuck with me. A retired guardsman trying to get a job loading cargo, only to be fired after a week because he stood too still and stared too long. He made the others nervous, the manager said. And the saddest part? He was trying. He just didn't know how to be anything else. Then there are those who beg. And yes, it happens. Not because they're lazy, not because they lack discipline, but because the system gives them no choice. You can't eat medals. You can't trade trauma for food. And in a city where even children steal to survive, a limping old guardsman with no home has no leverage. There are whispers that some of these beggars are fakes, wearing stolen uniforms to tug at people's pity. But the real ones? You can tell. It's in their eyes. That 1,000-yard stare never leaves. And still, even in all that misery, some of them cling to their pride. They won't take charity. They'll starve before they kneel. Because dignity is the only thing they have left, and giving that up would be the final defeat. You hear about old soldiers who die in alleys with a straight back and a sharpened piece of rebar beside them, like they were still waiting for one last fight. It's tragic, but there's a twisted nobility to it too. In a galaxy where death is constant and meaningless, choosing how you die might be the only control you ever get. There's this old meme in the community. What happens when the Emperor forgets your name? And the answer we all know is nothing. No thunderbolt from the sky, no divine wrath, just silence, bureaucratic indifference. You fade, cell by cell, memory by memory. And eventually, not even your regiment remembers you. But the fans do. That's the strange, beautiful thing. We talk about them. We write about them. We imagine them. Because we know that in a universe obsessed with sacrifice, the ones who live are the ones who suffer most. They survive the wars, but not the aftermath. And maybe, just maybe, if we keep telling their stories, we can give them back a shred of the honor the Imperium stole. Even if it's just in the hearts of those who care enough to look. Some guardsmen just can't stop fighting. Not because they're ordered to, not because they're paid to, but because it's the only thing they know how to do. The war gets into your bones. It rewrites you, makes you sharper, colder, more focused, less human maybe, but more alive in a way peace could never offer. So when the uniform's gone and the laser gun is taken from their hands, some veterans don't fade away like they're supposed to. They search for the next fight, because to them, the silence of peace is louder than any battlefield. There's a whole subset of fan theories about these so-called eternal soldiers. The men and women who survive multiple tours of duty, get discharged or left behind, and then immediately find a way back to the front lines. Not the same war, not the same banner, but war nonetheless. Some re-enlist through loopholes in distant subsector regiments, lying about their past service or using falsified ident codes. Others find more flexible employers, mercenary companies, frontier militias, rogue traders, Any place where violence is currency and experience is worth more than loyalty. One of the more popular legends is that of the Iron Dogs, a mercenary band allegedly formed entirely from ex-guardsmen who refused to retire. They roam the eastern fringe, offering their services to desperate colonies and corrupt planetary governors. They're not elegant, they're not kind, but they win. And some say they still salute the Emperor before every engagement, not out of devotion, but because they have no idea how not to. Imagine that. A group of half-broken veterans, soaked in trauma and blood, still whispering battlefield prayers before they burn another insurgent village to the ground. Others take darker paths. Not everyone joins a structured force. Some become bounty hunters, lethal, focused, unshakable, tracking renegades, heretics, or runaway psychers through the shadows of hive cities and across dead worlds. It's not exactly noble work, but for some of them, it's cleaner than trying to live a civilian life. The battlefield is simple. Targets, orders, kill or be killed. The rest of the galaxy is chaos in ways they were never trained to handle. There are even rumors of guardsmen becoming assassins. Not Eversor or Kalidas agents, nothing sanctioned. Just ghosts with a grudge and a blade. They work for crime lords, cults, sometimes even inquisitors operating off-book. One name keeps cropping up in fan circles. The Red Warden. No face, no past. Just the silhouette of an aging man in a flak duster, seen leaving the scenes of high-profile killings across half a dozen sectors. No one's confirmed if he ever wore the Guard's colors, but those who've seen his work say it has all the marks: controlled bursts, perfect sight lines, and a complete lack of mercy. But not all of them kill for money. Some go back to war as volunteers, not out of obligation, but because they need to. There are tales, especially in the Sabbat world's lore, of old veterans arriving at war zones, unarmed, unarmored, asking to join the fight. And sometimes they're allowed in, not officially, not on paper. But the kind of officer who's seen enough death knows the value of someone who already knows the dance. They get slotted into local PDF or left to hold a trench no one cares about. And they die quietly, as if they were always meant to. There's something deeply sad and deeply beautiful about that. These are men who've been burned out, discarded, left behind, and yet they still run toward the sound of gunfire. Not for glory, not for credits, just because it's the only place they ever felt real. There's a line from an old fanfic I remember. Peace is too quiet for those who came home full of screams. That's exactly it. They're not heroes anymore. They're echoes of a war that never ended. And let's be honest, there's something terrifying about that too. Because these are people trained to kill, hardened beyond reason, and now unshackled from any chain of command. The Imperium doesn't follow up on them. There's no registry, no psychological review, no surveillance. A man could disappear from the Guard and reappear 5 years later as a warlord on a feral world, commanding a private army of fellow survivors and exiles. It's rare, sure, but it happens. You'll find threads speculating on this all over fan forums. The idea that somewhere out there, a forgotten guardsman raised his own flag and built a life where the war never stops. Some see them as traitors, others as pragmatists. I just see them as lost souls looking for a familiar rhythm. Not all of them are violent, though. Some go back to war not with weapons, but with words. They become storytellers, war chroniclers, traveling between worlds, telling tales of battles most have never heard of. They speak in the hushed tones of survivors, describing hells that no scribe ever wrote down. And through that, maybe they're still fighting, this time against forgetfulness. Against the slow erosion of memory in a galaxy too vast to care. But for the rest, those who keep fighting because peace is poison, I don't blame them. How could I? They were built to survive war, not escape it. Their hearts beat to the rhythm of laser gun fire and orbital bombardments. Asking them to settle down, to become shopkeepers or hab cleaners, it's like asking a Lehman Russ to farm grain. Some machines just aren't made for it. So if you ever see a grizzled face in a mercenary unit, or hear about a war on some forsaken moon being turned around by a single old soldier, ask yourself, what if he's not doing it for gold or orders? What if he's just looking for a place where the screaming finally makes sense again? Coming home sounds like the one good ending a guardsman might still hope for. After years, sometimes decades, of horror, mud, blood, and loss, the idea of return carries weight. It's the dream whispered during night watches, the memory clung to in moments of despair. That maybe, just maybe one day you'll walk the streets of your birth hive again. That your family, your people, your old world will still be there, waiting, unchanged. But the truth is almost always colder. Because even when a guardsman survives the war and finds their way back, home doesn't feel like home anymore. It's a stranger's place. Or worse, it's a reflection that no longer fits the shape of the soul that's come back. The first thing they notice is the stillness. After years of movement, of shouting, of things exploding without warning, civilian life is eerily quiet. Even in a noisy hive, something feels off. People talk about taxes, food shortages, power fluctuations. They bicker over ration queues or complain about heat outages. And for the veteran standing there, with memories of watching entire planets burn, it all sounds like noise. Petty, soft, meaningless noise. It creates an invisible wall, a barrier of experience that no one around them can understand. And that loneliness cuts deeper than any loss wound. Then there's the routines. Wake up, eat, work, sleep. No patrols, no gear checks, no emergency sirens or command barked through a Vox bead. Just life. And for a lot of veterans, that feels like death. One fan described it perfectly, like being a weapon that's been placed back in its sheath, but the blade still twitches, wanting to be drawn again. The muscle memory doesn't go away, neither does the vigilance. So they pace. They check exits. They sit with their back to walls. They react to loud noises with the twitch of a hand that wants to reach for a weapon that's no longer there. It's not drama. It's instinct. It's survival baked too deep into the skin. Some try to reconnect, to find their families, their old neighbors, maybe an old lover who promised to wait. But time doesn't pause for the war-torn. People change. Some died. Some moved on. Some don't recognize them at all, especially if they come back half-augmetic, scarred beyond recognition, or bearing the strange behaviors that war carves into the soul. There are tales of veterans returning only to be treated like threats, hushed whispers about what he's seen, what he might have brought back, or worse, accusations of being spies, heretics, even chaos-touched, because the galaxy is paranoid by default. And someone who walked through hell and came back alive must have made a deal somewhere, right? Others try to blend in, get jobs, live quietly, but blending only works if you can forget. And guardsmen don't forget. They carry the screams, the faces, the weight of choices that can never be unmade. So they find themselves unable to laugh at jokes, unable to hold small talk, unable to care about promotions or market prices or entertainment feeds. The conversations feel hollow. The food tastes dull. The clothes feel strange. Everything that once meant something now feels like a faded photograph from a life that belonged to someone else. One of the hardest parts, and one fans often explore in fiction, is how veterans start to self-isolate. Not because they hate the people around them, but because they hate the difference. They feel like aliens among their own kind, and it becomes easier, less painful to just pull away, to live on the edge of town, to stop attending gatherings, to stop answering when someone knocks. They build routines that feel more like the Guard, early mornings, strict discipline, silence. Because if they can't go back to the battlefield, they can at least hold on to its structure, even if it means pushing everyone else away. And then there are the dreams. You'd think they'd find peace in familiar places, in childhood bedrooms or family kitchens. But the nightmares don't care about location. They follow, night after night, reliving trench collapses, ambushes, executions, watching friends die again and again. And no one around them understands. There are no medici who specialize in trauma, no sanctioned psychers allowed to heal the mind. You suffer in silence, because if you admit the nightmares are winning, someone might call the Arbites. Or worse, some eventually leave. Not because they're chased out, but because they can't pretend anymore. They pack what little they have and vanish, back to the stars, or to the outlands of the hive, or to the frozen edge of nowhere. And they leave no notes, because they know no one really expected them to stay. Some fans even say there's an unofficial term among old guard circles: the gray fade. It's what they call it when one of their own disappears without warning. No violence, no goodbye, just a silent retreat into obscurity. A final acknowledgement that peace wasn't made for people like them. And it's not bitterness that drives this. It's grief. Grief for what was lost, for what they became, for the fact that the galaxy moves on so easily without them. The ones who do stay often find some compromise. They raise groks on the outskirts. They sweep temple floors. They become the strange old man who scares the children but repairs broken things for free. They're part of the town, but apart from it, always just a little out of step. It's the cruelest twist of all, that for the few who survive the war, coming home can hurt more than the fighting ever did. Because war at least made sense. It was brutal, but it had structure. It gave purpose. Peace, on the other hand, demands something they no longer have, a way back into humanity that might be permanently sealed, and so they drift. Half there, half gone. And those who love them, if anyone does, can only watch and wonder what part of them never made it home. In every hive cathedral, on every shrine world, and even in the flickering pict feeds of under-hive cantinas, the image of the Imperial Guardsman veteran looms large, a towering figure cast in bronze and gold, jaw set in unwavering determination, one hand on a laser gun and the other raised in benediction to the God Emperor. The propaganda machine of the Adeptus Ministorum has worked for millennia to forge this myth. The ever-loyal, ever-faithful soldier who fights without fear and dies with a hymn on his lips. But the truth, as always, is messier, more painful, because real veterans don't fit that image, and many of them know it. The Ministorum loves veterans in theory. In their sermons, they speak of guardsmen as saints-in-waiting, chosen instruments of the Emperor's divine will. Statues of the eternal soldier are built in plazas, always with chiseled features, always clean, always dying nobly but beautifully. And that's the key. These are not depictions of the living. They are stories of the fallen. Martyrdom is easier to package. A dead guardsman can't ask uncomfortable questions or show the ugly costs of survival. He becomes a symbol, a tool, another piece of the Imperial faith engine. I've always found it strange how quickly the machine moves to immortalize the dead, but just as quickly ignores the living. The ones who return with missing limbs, trembling hands, and empty stares. They're not in the murals. They don't stand beside ecclesiarchs during parades. At best, they're used as props for recruiting drives. Look, this one came back. You might too. But even that is rare. More often, they're just inconvenient. The myth demands clean endings. But real veterans are walking contradictions. They survived when they shouldn't have. They saw things the sermons never mention. They remember the blood and filth and betrayal hidden behind every hymn of glory. Some fans argue that the Ministorum does this deliberately, that the myth of the Guardsman veteran is not just propaganda, it's insulation, a way to protect the populace from the unbearable truth that the Imperium eats its own. By turning veterans into perfect figures of selfless courage, it erases the trauma. It makes sacrifice look beautiful, and in doing so, it recruits more bodies for the grinder. But there's another side to this too. Some real veterans try to believe the myth. They stand straighter when hymns play. They attend commemorations. They recite the litanies. Not because they believe in the polished lie, but because they need to. Because if the myth is false, then everything they suffered through was for nothing. The Ministorum offers structure, a story to cling to, even if it's hollow, It's something. And sometimes when you're drowning in memories, a lie told with conviction feels better than the silence of doubt. Then there are those who rebel against it, who see their likeness twisted and polished until it no longer resembles anything human. They refuse to be used. There's one story that's made its way through fan circles, probably apocryphal but powerful nonetheless, about a one-eyed sergeant who disrupted a planetary victory ceremony by tearing down his own statue. He shouted, "I watched my regiment burn for a war no one remembers. Don't you dare call it noble." He was executed on the spot, of course, but that moment, real or not, lives on, because it says something we all feel, that honoring the dead is easy. Honoring the broken who still breathe, that's the real challenge. There's a quiet bitterness in the way veterans are sometimes turned into mascots, their names etched into memorials without their stories, their deeds simplified into lines of script on purity seals. The Guard is a machine, and when one cog survives, the machine doesn't stop to ask how or why. It just recasts the cog as a holy relic and moves on. But to the people who lived through it, those medals and inscriptions mean little. They remember the comrades who never got names on plaques. They remember orders that made no sense, and commanders who sent them to die for ground that would be lost again in a week. They remember, and the myth can never touch that. And yet, paradoxically, some veterans help build the myth. They speak in chapels. They give speeches. They recite the battle hymn with tears in their eyes. Not because they're deluded, but because they want to give the next generation something to believe in. Even if it's not true, it means something. A symbol to hold on to when the stars go dark. A story strong enough to make death feel less pointless. But the truth has weight too. And sometimes you'll find a bar deep in the lower levels of a hive, where a group of silent men share drinks and glances, never quite talking about the war but never leaving it either. And if a young recruit walks in, wide-eyed and full of fire, maybe one of the old ones will offer him a seat. And maybe, just maybe, he'll tell a version of the war that doesn't sound like a sermon. One where the heroes bled and screamed and cursed the Emperor under their breath. One where the only real honor was making sure your squad got through the night. That's the story I hold on to, not the gold-plated statues or the etched promises of eternal glory, but the tired voice of someone who was there, who knows the smell of burning promethium and the sound of a friend's last breath. Because in that voice, there's truth. And that truth, even when ugly, even when painful, that's more sacred than any sermon I've ever heard. You know what's strange? For all the sermons, murals, propaganda pics, and war hymns blasting through every voxcaster, the most powerful words about what it means to be a guardsman don't come from priests or officers. They come from the veterans themselves. The ones who, against every possible odd, survived and wrote. Not many do, of course. Keeping journals isn't exactly encouraged when your daily life includes trench foot, orbital bombardments, and commissars who might execute you for the wrong kind of reflection. But some did. Some left behind notes, field scribbles, vox recordings, or old cogitator logs tucked into data slates no one was meant to find. And fans. We've made a whole subculture out of reconstructing them. There's a collection called The Fragments of Tarnos, fan recreated from what's claimed to be a real journal written by a sergeant of the 34th Haracon. The fragments are messy, disjointed, sometimes incoherent. But in between the static and dried blood, there are moments of brutal clarity. There's one line I always come back to. I miss the sound of nothing. Not silence, nothing. The kind of stillness you only notice after your entire squad dies screaming. You can't fake that. That's not the kind of thing you write to impress a scribe. That's what bleeds out of you when there's no one left to hear. A lot of these recovered memoirs aren't even full stories. They're pieces. Broken thoughts scrawled into ration wrappers or carved into the underside of flak plates. One supposedly authentic piece, attributed to a Vostroyan conscript, reads, "Tell my boy I didn't run. I wanted to, Emperor, help me. I wanted to, but I didn't. That's it. That's the entire message. But it says more than 100 purity seals ever could. These men weren't fearless icons. They were terrified human beings who chose to stand anyway. Some fans dive deep into what they call ghost voices, posthumous Vox transmissions picked up from abandoned guard outposts or derelict ships. You'll find hundreds of threads dedicated to decoding those. Most are static, white noise, or scrambled orders. But every now and then, someone posts a cleaned-up segment. A dying trooper whispering the Emperor's name. A squad leader reciting casualty counts as his own blood floods the transmitter. One fan even claims to have found a full log from a guardsman assigned to the Arx Sylvae campaign, detailing how they held a tree line for 7 days with no food and 6 bullets between 12 men. It ends mid-sentence, the transmission cutting out right as he says, "I think they've started whispering again." And then nothing. Just that. Silence. But there are other kinds of stories too, not all bleak. Some weirdly tender. One of the most circulated fan reconstructions is The Last Laugh of Corporal Dren. It's supposedly based on Vox chatter from the siege of New Baruch. Dren, pinned down and bleeding out, spends his last 6 minutes telling jokes over the comms to keep morale up. Not good jokes, terrible ones. Puns, bad impressions of his drill sergeant. But the final message, the one he records just before the line goes dead, is him laughing and saying, "If the Emperor has a pub, I hope they serve Vostroyan brandy." And you know what? I want that to be real, because that's not a statue or a purity seal. That's humanity surviving war. There's a theory I've always liked, unproven, of course, that the Ordo Hereticus monitors these underground stories. Not to suppress them, but because they think truth told by survivors is more effective at breaking cult recruitment than all the scripted sermons in the galaxy. Because a guardsman saying, "I saw the warp and I didn't blink," hits harder than any Ministorum cleric ever could. Some Inquisitors allegedly even keep compilations of these veteran logs and distribute them to their own acolytes. Not as holy right, as warnings. You also see some of these voices in old scribal archives, sanctioned ones surprisingly. Every so often, a regiment gets glorified after being wiped out, and the scribes dig up personal accounts for dramatic effect. One preserved entry from the 18th Talern reads like a prayer and a confession. "We covered the dead with sand because we didn't want them watching. I told myself it was respect. It wasn't. I just couldn't look them in the eyes." That line gets quoted a lot, because it's real, because it's messy, because it doesn't end with a sermon. It just hurts. And maybe that's why we cling to these stories. Because they remind us that underneath the regimental numbers and flak armor, these soldiers were people. People who cried, who cursed, who broke down, who held each other during bombardments and shared what little rations they had with the dying. The propaganda machine can keep churning out myths, but the veterans, in their own broken way, left the truth behind. So if you ever stumble across one of those old field logs or read a fanfic that claims to be a recovered guardsman's diary, pause for a second. Imagine the voice behind it. Not a perfect soldier, not a bronze statue, just a tired human being, scrawling words in the dirt or whispering into a cracked Vox bead, hoping someone would remember. Not the battle, not the orders, them, their voice, their fear, their choice. Because sometimes in a galaxy where gods are silent and empires are built on corpses, the most sacred thing is a guardsman saying, "I was there, and I remember." When you really sit with it, let it sink in. The story of a retired guardsman isn't just a background detail or a footnote in the grimdark tapestry of Warhammer 40K. It's a mirror, a cracked, blood-smeared mirror held up to humanity in its rawest state. These aren't the demigods of the Adeptus Astartes or the sanctified martyrs of the Ecclesiarchy. These are the ordinary people, the billions, the ones who picked up a laser gun because they were told to, who went to war because it was that or execution, And somehow, despite all odds, some of them lived. And that's what makes it hurt more. Because survival in this universe doesn't mean escape. It means you carry the weight of everything you saw, and you do it alone. And yet, isn't there something almost defiant about that? The fact that in a galaxy built on faith, obedience, and sacrifice, these broken, limping souls still exist? Still walk, still breathe, still carry memories that the Imperium tried to bury under medals and statues and propaganda posters. In a way, I think the veterans are the most honest people in the entire setting. They don't believe in purity. They don't believe in destiny. They believe in mud and blood and pain and brotherhood. And they keep going anyway. Not because they expect reward, but because it's all they know. That kind of endurance? That's more terrifying and more inspiring than any sermon. There's a fan theory I keep coming back to. It says the true measure of humanity in the 41st millennium isn't in the greatness of its leaders or the might of its fleets. It's in the quiet suffering of the survivors, the ones who weren't chosen, weren't uplifted, weren't genetically enhanced, but who still fought, who still endured, and who came back even when there was nothing to come back to. That's humanity's real power, not strength, not genius, just the refusal to fall all the way apart. And the Imperium? It doesn't know what to do with that. It can process death. It loves death. It turns it into iconography. But a guardsman who lives? Who comes back full of ghosts and bitterness and stories that contradict the official reports? That's a problem. That's a liability. So they're hidden, forgotten, left to rot in quiet corners where the truth won't contaminate the next wave of recruits. But we remember them. The community remembers. Through headcanons, fanfics, voice recordings, old army lists with hand-scrawled names beside the units. We build them back, even when the lore doesn't. It says something about us as fans, too, that we want these stories, that we chase them, that we aren't satisfied with just the glory shots and heroic charges. We dig for the aftershocks, the silence after the battle, the man who wakes up sweating in a hive-hab unit, hand twitching for a laser gun that isn't there. The woman who survived 6 campaigns and now grows mushrooms alone in a cave because it's the only place quiet enough to let her think. These aren't just characters. They're reminders of cost, of survival, of the fact that even in a universe this brutal humanity still flickers under all the armor and ash. So if you've come this far, I hope you'll carry one thing with you. Somewhere on some forgotten world, there's an old guardsman. Not a hero, not a legend, just a person who endured. And maybe, if we talk about them enough, remember them enough, write about them enough, they won't disappear completely into the cracks of Imperial silence. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think happens to these people. Have you written stories about them? Do you think there's a forgotten system where they've built a quiet society of their own? Or do you believe the Imperium swallows them whole and never spits them back out? I want to hear your theories, your grief, your hope. And if this spoke to you, even just a little, share it. Let other people hear it too. These aren't the stories the Ministorum wants told, but they're the ones that matter. And if you want to keep exploring more of the unseen corners of the 41st millennium, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit that bell. And remember, somewhere, someone survived. And that survival means something, even here, even now.